I want to start by telling you something that I still think about every single day. Not because it was the most dramatic moment of my life, though it was. Not because it was the scariest, though it was that too. I think about it every day because of how ordinary the moment was right before it happened. I was standing in my kitchen. It was a Tuesday evening in late October, the kind of evening where the light outside goes gray and soft, and the house gets quiet in that particular way that only happens when you live somewhere long enough to know all its sounds. I had a cup of coffee going. There was a baseball game on the television in the other room that I wasn't really watching. Carol, my wife, had left about an hour earlier for her book club. She goes every other Tuesday, has gone for years. I was reaching past her purse on the counter to grab the sugar, and I knocked it off. It hit the floor and the contents scattered the way purse contents always do. Her wallet, her lipstick, her reading glasses in that little case she's had since 2015, her hand lotion, her library badge on the lanyard. I crouched down and started gathering everything up. And that's when I saw it. A phone. Now, Carol has a phone. An iPhone. She's had the same model for 2 years. I know what it looks like. I've handed it to her 100 times. This was not that phone. This was a small, thin device. Black. A prepaid style, the kind you see in a rack near the register at a gas station. The screen was cracked in one corner. A hairline fracture running from the top right down toward the center. The casing was scratched. This phone had been used. It had been carried around. It was not new. I picked it up and I just held it for a moment. Now, I want to be honest with you, my first thought was not suspicion. My first thought was genuinely practical. I thought maybe she had gotten a second line for some work purpose, or maybe she was holding it for someone, or maybe she had picked it up somewhere and forgotten to mention it. I am not, by nature, a suspicious man. I want you to know that about me. I spent 30-some years as a civil engineer. I am a facts-first kind of person. I do not catastrophize. I do not assume. I set the phone on the counter. I finished gathering the rest of her things, put them back in the purse, and set the purse back where it had been. And then I stood there looking at that phone. I should tell you, before I go any further, that some of the details in this story have been changed to protect the people involved, including my children. The names, certain locations, a few specific dates, but the events themselves. Every single thing I'm about to tell you is real. This happened to me. And if you're watching this tonight from your living room or your bedroom, maybe lying in bed with the lights off, I want you to ask yourself something as we go. I want you to ask yourself, would you have seen it coming? Because I didn't. And I thought I knew my wife better than I knew anyone on this earth. I picked up the phone. I wasn't going to look through it. I told myself I was just going to check if it was on, if it had service. Maybe see if there was an obvious explanation sitting right on the lock screen. That's what I told myself. It was locked. No notifications visible. No name on the screen. Just a plain black background and a 4-digit PIN prompt. I set it back down. And then it rang. I want you to understand what that felt like. The phone was sitting on my kitchen counter, face up, and it started to vibrate and ring with a sound that was slightly too loud for the quiet kitchen. No name appeared on the screen. No number. Just the word private. I stared at it for 2 full rings. On the 3rd ring, I picked it up. I don't know why. To this day, I couldn't fully explain it to you. Something in me, some instinct older than reason, made me press the green button and lift that phone to my ear. I didn't say hello. I didn't say anything. I just listened. There was a pause, maybe 2 seconds. And then a man's voice said, very clearly, very calmly, "Raymond, don't hang up." I hung up. I set the phone down on the counter, and I stepped back from it like it was something that could hurt me. My heart was going in a way I hadn't felt since a health scare about 8 years ago. My hands. I looked at my hands, and they were not quite steady. He knew my name. A man calling a secret phone that I was never supposed to find. Calling from a private number. Calling while my wife was away from the house. And the first thing out of his mouth was my name. Not hello, not is Carol there. My name. Raymond. Like he had been expecting me. Like somehow, impossibly, he had known it would be me answering. I stood in that kitchen for a long time. The baseball game murmured from the other room. The coffee maker finished its cycle. Outside, a car passed slowly on our street. I did not touch the phone again that night, but I also did not put it back in her purse. I took a photograph of it, front and back, with my own phone. Then I put it back exactly where I had found it, tucked it into the inside pocket of Carol's purse, where it had been sitting, and I went and sat down in the living room. When Carol came home at 9:15, I told her the game had been boring and that I was going to head up to bed early. She kissed me on the cheek. She smelled like the vanilla candle they always burn at Sandra's house where the book club meets. She looked exactly like herself, completely normal, completely familiar. I lay in the dark that night listening to her breathing even out beside me, and I thought about a stranger who already knew my name. If you're watching this from somewhere quiet tonight, I want to know where you are. Drop it in the comments and tell me, if you found something like that, what would you do? Would you confront your spouse right then? Or would you wait and watch? Because what I decided to do next changed everything. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I drifted in and out of something that felt like sleep but wasn't. That half-conscious state where your body is still but your mind is running hard, pulling at threads, replaying moments, asking questions that don't have answers yet. I watched the ceiling go from black to dark gray to the pale early light of a Wednesday morning. Carol slept beside me the whole time, deeply, peacefully, the way she always slept. That was the thing that kept catching me. How normal she looked. By 6 in the morning, I was downstairs making coffee. I'm a methodical man. I have always been methodical. In my career as a civil engineer, I spent 30 years solving problems by first making sure I understood exactly what the problem was before I touched anything. You don't start digging until you know what's underneath. You don't tear out a wall until you understand what it's holding up. I told myself to apply that same discipline here. I told myself that one strange phone and one strange phone call did not necessarily mean what my worst instincts were telling me it meant. So before I did anything else, before I investigated a single thing, I made myself sit down and think honestly about the life Carol and I had built together. I made myself look at it clearly. Because if I was going to understand what was wrong, I first needed to be honest about what had been right. Carol and I met in the spring of 1991. I was 29 years old and working for a municipal engineering firm in Columbus, Ohio. She was 27, finishing a library science degree at Ohio State. We met at a fundraiser for a local literacy program. The kind of event where you go because a coworker guilts you into it and you spend the first hour looking for the exit. I saw her standing near a table of donated books, reading the back cover of something, completely unbothered by the noise around her. I walked over and made some forgettable comment about the book. She looked up and gave me a look that was equal parts amused and unimpressed. I asked her to dinner 3 days later. She said yes, but she made me pick somewhere that wasn't a chain restaurant. I took her to a small Italian place on the east side of Columbus that my father had liked. She ordered in Italian. Badly, she later admitted, but with tremendous confidence. I was completely gone by the end of that first meal. We were married in June of 1993. Our son Derek was born in 1996. Our daughter Nina came along in 1999. We moved to Harwick, a mid-sized town in central Ohio, the kind of place where everybody waves when they pass you on the road, and the high school football team is a genuine community event. When Derek was 2 years old, because I had been offered a position with a regional firm there, and because Carol said she wanted the kids to grow up somewhere with a backyard and a library she could walk to, we built a life there, a real one. I coached Derek's Little League team for 4 seasons. Carol ran the summer reading program at the Harwick Public Library for 11 years straight. We went to church most Sundays, not out of deep conviction, but out of community, because we liked the people and because it gave the kids a sense of roots. We took a family vacation every summer, always driving distance, always something the kids could look back on. The Smoky Mountains, Niagara Falls, a long weekend in Washington, D.C., when Derek was 12 and Nina was 9, and both of them complained the entire drive there, and then didn't want to leave when it was time to go home. We were not a flashy family. We were not a dramatic family. Our arguments, when we had them, were about normal things. Money during the lean years when the engineering firm had layoffs, disagreements about how firm to be with the kids, the occasional flare-up about whose turn it was to deal with the contractor when the basement flooded in 2007. We made up. We moved on. We were steady. That steadiness was something I had always valued more than I probably ever told Carol directly. I grew up in a house that was not steady. My father, a man named Gerald, whom I will tell you much more about as this story goes on, was not a stable presence. He was charming and generous when things were good and cold and unreachable when they weren't. My mother did her best. I had spent most of my adult life building the opposite of what I grew up in. And I believed, genuinely, completely believed, that I had succeeded. By the time I was sitting at that kitchen table on that Wednesday morning with my coffee going cold in front of me, Carol and I had been married 32 years. Our kids were grown and out of the house. Derek lived 40 minutes away with his girlfriend. Nina had moved to Pittsburgh 2 years earlier for a job in healthcare administration. Carol was working 3 days a week at the library. She had scaled back when I semi-retired 5 years ago, because we didn't need the income, and because she said she wanted time to breathe. We had a good house, modest savings, no serious debt. 2 reasonably well-adjusted adult children who called on weekends. From the outside, and honestly, from the inside too, most days, it looked like exactly what it was supposed to be. A good marriage, a good life. The kind of quiet, earned happiness that doesn't make for exciting stories at dinner parties, but that most people, if they're being honest, would take in a heartbeat. And sitting there that morning, staring at the grain of the kitchen table, I tried very hard to hold on to all of that, to remind myself of its reality, its weight. 32 years is not a small thing. 32 years is a person's history. It is children and arguments and inside jokes and shared grief and the particular way someone loads the dishwasher and the sound of their key in the door at the end of the day. But underneath all of that, underneath every warm memory I was trying to hold up like a shield, there was a voice on a phone. Raymond, don't hang up. And the more I sat with it, the more I realized something that genuinely frightened me. It wasn't just the phone call that scared me. It was the fact that the man's voice had been calm, not nervous, not surprised, not the voice of someone who had dialed a wrong number or stumbled into something unexpected. He had said my name the way you say the name of someone you already know is on the other end of the line. There was no hesitation in it, no question mark. Just Raymond. Like he had been waiting for exactly this. And I thought about Carol, asleep upstairs, breathing evenly, smelling like Sandra's vanilla candle. How long had that phone been in her purse? How many Tuesday evenings had I been sitting in this same kitchen, not knowing? I picked up my own phone and looked at the photograph I had taken the night before. The cracked screen, the scratched casing, the plain black background. I am not, as I said, a suspicious man, but I am an engineer. And an engineer knows that when something doesn't fit, when a measurement is off, when a material behaves in a way it shouldn't, when the numbers don't add up no matter how many times you run them, you don't look away from it. You don't convince yourself the problem isn't there. You go back to the beginning. You find out what you missed. I heard Carol's footsteps on the stairs. I put my phone face down on the table and picked up my coffee cup and looked out the window at the backyard. The oak tree we planted the year Derek was born. The garden Carol kept for years and then gradually let go when her back started bothering her. The old fence that needed repainting and that I kept telling myself I'd get to. She came into the kitchen in her robe, hair still down, squinting slightly the way she always did in the morning light. "You're up early," she said. "Couldn't sleep," I said. Which was true. She poured herself a coffee, stood at the counter looking out the same window I'd been looking at. "The oak is really starting to turn," she said. "Look at that color." "Beautiful," I said. And I meant it. And I hated that I meant it. And I sat there at that table, watching my wife of 32 years admire a tree we had planted together. And I thought, I don't know who you are. I thought, how long have I not known? I want to ask you something before we go any further. Think about the person you have loved longest in your life. Your spouse, your partner, a parent, a sibling. How well do you think you really know them? Not the version of them they present every day, but the version underneath. The history they carry that maybe they never fully showed you. Because what I was about to discover was not just about Carol. It went much deeper than that. It went all the way back to my father. And that part of the story, I was not prepared for at all. There is a particular kind of pain that comes not from discovering something new, but from realizing that the signs were always there. That is what the next few days felt like for me. Not the sharp pain of a fresh wound. More like pressing on a bruise you didn't know you had, and suddenly understanding that it had been there for a long time, quietly hurting in the background while you went about your life pretending everything was fine. I did not confront Carol. Not yet. Every instinct in me that had been trained by 30 years of engineering work told me that a premature confrontation, one made before I understood the full picture, would only give her the opportunity to close doors I hadn't finished opening yet. So I watched. I listened. And I thought. I gave myself 1 week to simply remember. I sat down at my desk in the small office I keep off the back hallway. The room Carol calls my cave, the one with the bookshelves and the old drafting table I kept for sentimental reasons. And I opened a fresh document on my laptop. I titled it simply, Things I Noticed. And I started writing down every moment from the past 2 years that had felt slightly off. Every small thing I had dismissed or explained away, or simply filed under not worth worrying about. What came out of me surprised me. I had thought there would be a handful of things, maybe 3 or 4 small incidents, the kind of minor behavioral oddities that exist in any long marriage and mean absolutely nothing. Instead, I filled 2 pages. The first thing I wrote down was the Tuesday evenings. Carol had been going to her book club on alternating Tuesdays for years. I couldn't tell you exactly when it started. It had become so routine that it had simply become part of the fabric of our week. But somewhere in the last 18 months, the evenings had started running longer. She used to be home by 8:30, sometimes 8. Lately it was 9, 9:15, occasionally closer to 9:30. When I had mentioned it once, casually, not accusatorially, just noting it, she had said Sandra liked to open a second bottle of wine toward the end of the evening, and things tended to run over. I had accepted that completely. Why wouldn't I? The second thing I wrote down was the email. About 14 months ago, I had been using Carol's laptop to print something. My own printer had been acting up, and hers was closer, and I had accidentally clicked on her mail application instead of the browser. It opened to an inbox I didn't recognize. Not her regular address, which I knew. This was a different address entirely, something with numbers in it, the kind of address that looks deliberately anonymous. She had come into the room while I was still registering what I was seeing and taken the laptop from me very smoothly, very naturally, saying something about needing to check something herself. I had thought nothing of it. People have multiple email addresses. I have two myself. But I wrote it down. The third thing, and this one bothered me more than I wanted to admit when I saw it written out in front of me, was the cash. I handle our finances. I always have. Not because Carol isn't capable, but because I am the one who genuinely enjoys the organizational aspect of it. I do our taxes myself. I track our accounts monthly. And looking back now, with fresh eyes, I could remember noticing on at least 3 or 4 separate occasions over the past year and a half that there had been ATM withdrawals from our joint checking account that I couldn't immediately account for. $200, sometimes $250, always from the same ATM at a grocery store about a mile and a half from our house. Always on a weekday, usually midweek. When I had noticed them, I want to be clear about that. I am not someone who misses line items. I had told myself it was household cash, groceries, the occasional purchase from a local vendor who didn't take cards. Carol had always managed the day-to-day household spending in cash, and I had never questioned it. There was never a time I needed cash and didn't have it. So I had let those withdrawals sit there in the ledger, unquestioned, month after month. $200 every 2 weeks, for 18 months. That was nearly $2,400 that I had no specific accounting for. I wrote it down. The fourth thing, and this one is the one that had nagged at me most persistently even at the time, even when I had done my best to dismiss it, was a name. Marcus. About a year ago, Carol had been on the phone in the kitchen when I came in from outside. She hadn't heard me come in. The side door sticks, and I had learned to lift it slightly as I opened it, which meant it didn't make the usual sound. She was speaking in a low, calm voice, and I caught a fragment of the conversation as I came down the back hallway. I heard her say, "Tell Marcus that I handled it, and that everything is fine on this end." Then she heard me. She turned around, finished the call with a very normal-sounding, "Okay, talk soon," and put her phone in her pocket. I had asked, lightly, who she was talking to. She had said it was Sandra, dealing with some drama in the book club about a member who hadn't been pulling her weight on the hosting rotation. She had moved immediately to asking me about my afternoon. I had let it go. But the name Marcus had stayed with me in the background. Not loudly, not urgently, just as a small, faint note that occasionally surfaced and then submerged again. I wrote it down. I sat back and looked at my list. Tuesday evenings running late. A second email address. Unexplained cash withdrawals. A name mentioned once and quickly buried. None of these things, on their own, would have alarmed any reasonable person. That's the thing about a well-constructed deception. and I was beginning to understand, with a cold and growing certainty, that what I was looking at was constructed. It had been built carefully. Each individual piece was deniable, explainable, forgettable. It was only when you laid them all out together that the shape of something began to emerge. I thought about a term we used sometimes in structural engineering: cumulative stress. It refers to the way a structure can absorb individual loads indefinitely, each one within tolerance, each one manageable on its own, until one day the combined weight of all those loads exceeds what the structure was designed to hold. And the thing fails. Not because of the last load, because of all of them together. I had been absorbing individual loads for at least 18 months, maybe longer. That thought, maybe longer, is what made me pull up our bank statements on my laptop that afternoon. Not just the past 18 months. I went back further. I pulled up 3 years of records and went through them line by line the way I should have been doing all along. The cash withdrawals didn't start 18 months ago. They started 3 years ago. Almost exactly 3 years ago, in the November of the year before last. $200, sometimes $250, regular as a utility bill, every 2 weeks without fail. 36 months, roughly 72 withdrawals. I did the rough math in my head and had to set my coffee cup down. Somewhere between $14,000 and $15,000, withdrawn in cash over 3 years from our joint account. I sat in my office for a long time after that. I want to tell you, and I mean this sincerely, that even then, even at that moment, I was not ready to conclude the worst. I know that might be hard to understand, but 32 years of trust is not nothing. It is not a thing you discard the moment the numbers start to look strange. I still wanted there to be an explanation. I still wanted to be wrong. But I knew I needed help. I needed someone who could look at this without the emotional weight I was carrying. Someone who knew how these things worked. I called Bud. Bud Callahan had been my closest friend for over 20 years. We had met through a neighborhood association meeting, the kind where everyone shows up annoyed about a zoning decision and leaves somehow having made a friend, and had stayed close ever since. Bud had spent 23 years as a detective with the county sheriff's department before retiring 5 years ago. He was 64, blunt, funny when he wanted to be, and entirely without illusion about human nature. He was the right person to call. I didn't tell him everything. Not yet. I told him I had found what appeared to be a prepaid burner phone in a family member's belongings, and that I had questions about what that typically indicated. I kept it vague. I wasn't ready to say Carol's name out loud in this context. Not yet. Bud went quiet for a moment after I finished. Then he said, "Those phones are almost always about one of 3 things. Privacy from a partner, which means either an affair or a surprise. Communication that someone doesn't want on a regular phone record. Or operational use, meaning it's part of something organized." I asked him what he meant by operational use. He said, "Meaning it's not personal, meaning someone gave it to them for a specific purpose, and they're using it as instructed. That's the one you don't want it to be, Ray." I thanked him and told him I'd explain more when I knew more. He said, "Be careful. Whoever is on the other end of that phone, if it's the 3rd thing, they already know more about you than you know about them." I hung up and sat in the quiet of my office. They already know more about you than you know about them. And I thought, a man called a phone he shouldn't have known existed, and the first word out of his mouth was my name. Bud was right. They already did. I need to ask you something. If you went back through the last 3 years of your life and wrote down every small thing that felt slightly off, every moment you dismissed, every question you let go, What would your list look like? How long would it be? Because mine was longer than I ever expected, and I hadn't even gotten to the part that would truly undo me. That was still coming. There is a difference between suspecting something and deciding to find out the truth. Suspicion is passive. It lives in your chest like a low hum, uncomfortable but containable. It allows you the option of turning away, of choosing not to know, of telling yourself that the thing you're afraid of isn't real because you haven't confirmed it yet. Deciding to find out the truth is something else entirely. It is an active choice. And once you make it, you cannot unmake it. You cannot find half the truth and stop. You cannot unknow what you discover. I understood that clearly as I sat in my office that afternoon with Bud's words still in my ears. I made the choice anyway. That evening, I behaved exactly as I always did. I made dinner, a simple pasta, the kind I make when I don't want to think too hard about cooking. Carol came home from the library at her usual time, changed out of her work clothes, sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water, and told me about a new display she was putting together for the children's section. Something about local history. She was animated about it in the quiet, genuine way she always got when she was working on something at the library that she cared about. I listened. I asked questions. I refilled her water glass. We watched television after dinner. A nature documentary, I think. Something about migration patterns. I cannot tell you a single thing about it. At 10:30, Carol said she was going up to bed. She kissed me on the top of my head the way she had done for years, a small, habitual gesture that I had always found comforting without ever really thinking about it. I told her I'd be up in a little while. I waited until I heard the bedroom door close and the sounds of her getting ready for bed. The running water, the familiar creak of the mattress. Then I waited another 20 minutes. When the house had been fully quiet Pamut for long enough, I got up slowly and went to the entryway, where Carol's purse hung on the hook by the door. I had been thinking about this all evening. I had rehearsed it in my mind, the angle I would need to reach without disturbing the purse's position, the interior pocket where I had seen the phone, how to replace it exactly as I found it. I reached in carefully. The phone was there. I brought it to the kitchen, set it on the counter under the light, and looked at it closely for the first time without the shock of discovery distorting my perception. It was a basic prepaid model. I recognized the brand, a budget line sold at convenience stores and pharmacies, the kind that comes with a small number of prepaid minutes and can be reloaded with cash cards. The kind that leaves almost no paper trail if you are careful about how you use it. The casing was a matte black plastic, worn smooth in the places where fingers would naturally hold it. The crack in the screen ran from the upper right corner and stopped about a third of the way down. There was a small scuff on the back near the bottom edge, the kind of mark you get from setting a phone down on a rough surface repeatedly. This phone had been used for a long time. I photographed it again, front, back, both sides. I photographed the model number printed on the back casing. Then I turned it over and with a thumbnail carefully eased off the back panel. The SIM card slot was empty. Whoever had set this phone up had removed the SIM, which meant the phone either operated on Wi-Fi only, or the SIM was stored separately, or it had already been disposed of and replaced. I replaced the back panel and photographed the battery compartment anyway. Then I reassembled it exactly as it had, and photographed the whole thing one final time from directly above. I stood there a moment longer, looking at this small, damaged, anonymous object, and thought about all the conversations that had passed through it. All the things said and heard and planned. In my house, while I slept upstairs, while I made dinner, while I sat in the next room watching television programs I couldn't remember. I put the phone back. I went to bed. I did not sleep. The next morning, after Carol left for the library, I went back to my bank records. What I had found the day before, the cash withdrawals going back 3 years, had opened a door in my mind that I now needed to walk through fully. I pulled up the most complete records I could access, going back as far as our online banking system allowed, which was 7 years. The withdrawals going back 3 years were consistent and clear, but before that, in years 4, 5, 6, and 7, the pattern was less regular. There were still periodic cash withdrawals of similar amounts, but they were less frequent and slightly less consistent. The spacing was irregular, sometimes 6 weeks apart instead of 2, sometimes slightly larger amounts. What that told me, and I want to be careful here, because I am not a financial investigator and I knew my interpretation could be wrong, was that whatever this cash was being used for, it had started small and inconsistent and had grown over time into something more regular, more established, more routine. Whatever this was, it had been going on for much longer than 3 years. It had been going on, by my rough estimation, for the better part of a decade, possibly longer. I closed the laptop and sat very still for a long time. Then I went to the filing cabinet in my office. I am organized about documents, always have been. I keep records in labeled folders, tax returns going back 15 years, insurance documents, property records, vehicle titles, the kids' old school records that I kept for reasons I can't entirely explain. I went through the household files methodically, looking for anything that seemed out of place, any document I didn't recognize, any account I couldn't account for. I found nothing unusual in the files themselves. But in the process of going through them, I pulled out a folder labeled Miscellaneous, Carol, that contained things like her library certification renewals, an old passport, her graduate school transcripts, and a few personal documents she had asked me to file years ago. I flipped through them without expecting to find anything. Near the bottom of the folder was a folded piece of paper that I didn't recognize. When I opened it, it was a receipt from a document notarization service, the kind of storefront place that handles legal paperwork for a fee. The receipt was dated 4 years ago. The service described was notarization of business formation documents. The recipient name on the receipt was not Carol's married name. It was her maiden name, Carol Ann Whitfield. I set the paper down on my desk. Carol had not used her maiden name, to my knowledge, in any formal context since we had married in 1993. She had taken my name, Pruitt, completely and without reservation. Her library credentials were under Pruitt. Her driver's license, her social security card on file, everything I had ever seen. Pruitt. But 4 years ago, Carol Ann Whitfield had notarized business formation documents at a storefront service in a town I recognized as being about 30 miles from Harwick. I took a photograph of the receipt. Then I put it back exactly where I had found it, replaced the folder, and closed the filing cabinet. I went to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and stood at the window looking out at the backyard. The oak tree Derek and I had planted the year he was born was fully turned now, the leaves a deep burning orange against the flat gray October sky. I thought about calling Bud again. I thought about what I would say. I thought about the receipt and the cash withdrawals and the phone and the man who had said my name before I had said a word. I called Bud. This time I told him more. Not everything. Not Carol's name, not the notarization receipt, not the depth of the bank records. But I told him about the phone, about the call, about the pattern of cash withdrawals. I told him the amounts and the regularity. I told him the phone appeared to be a prepaid model with no SIM and showed signs of extended use. Bud listened without interrupting. That was one of the things I had always valued about him. He listened the way investigators listen, not waiting for his turn to speak, but actually taking in and processing information. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The no-SIM thing is notable. That's not something a civilian typically thinks to do. Somebody coached whoever is using that phone on operational security. That's not a small thing, Ray." I asked him what operational security meant in this context. He said, "It means someone is being careful in a way that suggests they've been told to be careful by someone who knows what they're doing. The cash pattern you're describing, regular, moderate amounts, consistent over years, that's not random spending. That's structured. I've seen that kind of pattern in organized financial activity, money movement, keeping things off the books." I told him about the name Marcus. I told him I'd heard it once and it had been quickly buried. Bud said, "I want you to listen to me carefully. Do not confront anyone yet. Do not let on that you know anything. If this is what it's starting to look like, the worst thing you can do right now is tip your hand before you understand the full picture. Can you do that?" I told him I could. He said, "Good. And Ray, be careful with your own phone. If someone is running any kind of operation through your household, and they're serious about it, which it's starting to sound like they might be, they may be more aware of your communications than you think." After I hung up, I sat in my office for a long time. I was 61 years old. I had been married for 32 years. I had built what I believed was a calm, honest, uncomplicated life. And I was sitting in the room I called my cave, surrounded by 30 years of professional files and family photographs, and a drafting table I kept for sentimental reasons, thinking about operational security and structured cash movement, and a man who knew my name. I looked at the photograph on my desk, the one from Derek's wedding rehearsal dinner 3 years ago. Carol and me, standing in the golden evening light outside the restaurant, her head tilted slightly toward my shoulder, both of us smiling at whoever was behind the camera. I remembered the exact moment. I remembered how happy I had felt. I thought, how many lies were already in motion the night that photograph was taken? I didn't have an answer, but I was going to find one. I want to pause here and ask you something. Has there ever been a moment in your life when you realized that something you completely trusted had been quietly wrong for a long time, and you just hadn't seen it? Not a betrayal, necessarily. Just a truth that had been waiting for you to be ready to find it. Because what I was about to discover when I followed Carol on that Tuesday, the meeting I was not supposed to see, the man I was not supposed to know about, that changed the entire shape of the story I thought I was living. And it turned out that story was much older than I knew. I had never followed my wife before. I want to be clear about that. In 32 years of marriage, I had never once driven behind Carol without her knowledge, never checked her whereabouts, never questioned where she said she was going. It was not naivety exactly. It was trust. The deep, unexamined kind that builds up over decades like sediment, layer by layer, until it becomes the bedrock of everything you do without even thinking about it. Sitting in my car 2 blocks from our house on the following Tuesday evening, watching her reverse out of the driveway, I felt the full weight of what I was doing. It felt wrong in a way that had nothing to do with guilt. It felt wrong the way it feels wrong to open a letter that isn't addressed to you. Even when you know that what's inside matters, and that you have a right to know what it says. I gave her half a block before I pulled out. It was early November by then. Dark came fast. The streets were quiet in that particular Tuesday evening way. Most people already home, most porch lights on, the occasional dog walker moving through the amber pools of streetlight. I kept 2 cars between us where I could, and told myself to breathe evenly. Carol drove her usual route toward the center of town. I watched her turn left on Garfield, which was the direction of Sandra's neighborhood, where the book club was held. For about 90 seconds, I thought I had been wrong about everything. I thought, she is going to book club. She's going to sit in Sandra's living room and drink wine and argue about whatever novel they are reading, and come home smelling like vanilla candle, and I am going to feel like a fool, and we are never going to speak of this. Then she turned right on Meridian instead of continuing on Garfield. Meridian runs east, away from Sandra's neighborhood, away from the center of town, toward the highway. I followed. She took the on-ramp for Route 40 heading east and settled into a steady highway speed. Not fast, not slow. The drive of someone who had made this trip before and was not in a hurry. I stayed 3 car lengths back and kept the headlights of the vehicle between us as cover. The highway stretched out flat and dark through the Ohio countryside. The occasional light from a farmhouse set back from the road, the glow of a gas station at an exit, the flat black shapes of harvested fields on either side. After about 25 minutes, she took an exit I didn't immediately recognize. I had to think for a moment before I placed it. Kellerton. A small town about 38 miles from Harwick. I had driven through it maybe twice in my life. The kind of place you pass through rather than go to. A grain elevator visible from the highway. A water tower. A cluster of commercial buildings along the main road. Carol turned into the parking lot of a diner called the Millstone. It was a low, wide building with large windows along the front, neon signage in the windows. The parking lot may be half full on a Tuesday night. A local place, the kind that serves breakfast all day and has pie under a glass dome on the counter. I parked at the far end of the lot, engine off, lights off. Far enough that I was in shadow, but close enough that the large front windows gave me a clear sight line into the dining room. Carol went inside. I watched through the window as she was greeted by a server and led to a booth near the back left of the room. Not a window booth, not visible from the parking lot entrance. Deliberately private without being obviously so. She slid into the seat facing the door. She did not look at her phone. She did not look around nervously. She sat the way someone sits when they are waiting for a meeting they have had many times before. 4 minutes later, a man came in. Late 50s, I estimated. Maybe early 60s. He was well built without being imposing. The kind of frame that suggests someone who had been physically active in their younger years and had maintained it without vanity. He was wearing a dark jacket, collared shirt, no tie. His hair was mostly gray, cut short and neat. He walked through the diner without looking around, went directly to Carol's booth, and sat down across from her. They did not hug. They did not shake hands. There was no greeting that I could read as romantic. No lean forward, no touching of hands across the table. None of the body language that I had steeled myself for and had half expected to see. They simply sat across from each other in the manner of two people with business to conduct. And that, the absence of any warmth, the pure functional quality of how they sat together, frightened me more than an embrace would have. I picked up my phone and zoomed the camera as far as it would go through the windshield. The image was grainy through the glass and at that distance, but I could make out their face clearly enough. I took a series of photographs. The man's profile, his posture. The way he had his hands flat on the table in front of him, not gesturing, just present. Carol nodding at something he said, then speaking, then nodding again. They talked for 43 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on my dashboard the entire time. There was a moment, about 20 minutes in, when Carol reached into her bag and produced what appeared to be a standard white envelope, letter-sized, sealed, and slid it across the table. The man picked it up without looking at it and put it inside his jacket. That gesture, so practiced, so unremarkable, so clearly not the first time, sat in my stomach like a stone. When they finished, there was no prolonged goodbye. The man left first. Carol remained seated for perhaps 2 minutes, looking at nothing in particular, then gathered her things and left. I slid down in my seat as she walked through the parking lot to her car. She did not look in my direction. She drove back toward the highway. I sat in the parking lot of the Millstone Diner for a few minutes before I moved. Then I did what I had been planning to do if the opportunity arose. I got out of the car and walked to the man's vehicle, a dark blue sedan parked 3 spaces from the entrance, and photographed the license plate, front and back, the vehicle itself, the make, model, color, a small parking permit sticker on the inside of the windshield that I couldn't read clearly, but photographed anyway. Then I drove home. I got home 12 minutes before Carol did. I changed my shoes, hung up my jacket, put the kettle on, and was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea when she came through the door. She was carrying her book club bag, the canvas tote she always took on Tuesdays, the one with the library's logo on the side. She smelled like vanilla candle. I thought about that for a moment. I thought, she stopped somewhere on the way home. Or she carries the candle scent as cover. Or Sandra's house is somehow part of this too. I filed it away and said nothing. "Good book club?" I asked. "Really good," she said. "We're reading that novel I told you about, the one set in Portugal. Everybody loved it." "That's nice," I said. She made herself a cup of tea and we sat together at the kitchen table for 20 minutes, talking about nothing of consequence. She told me Derek had called her that afternoon. She told me the library was getting a new self-checkout system that she wasn't sure about. She told me she thought we should have Nina come visit before the holidays because she seemed lonely in Pittsburgh. I agreed with everything. After she went to bed, I went back to my office and sent Bud the photographs. Bud called me the next morning before 8. He had run the partial plate. He still had contacts, he told me. People who owed him favors from his years on the job, and had gotten a registered owner. The vehicle was not registered to an individual. It was registered to a business entity. Halcyon Consulting Group, LLC. I wrote the name down on a notepad, even though I had already committed it to memory. I asked Bud what he could find out about it. He said he'd make some calls. He told me in the meantime I should search it myself. Publicly available business records, state filings, anything accessible without specialized access. He said to look for registered agents, director names, filed addresses. I spent the rest of that morning on my laptop. Halcyon Consulting Group, LLC had a minimal online presence, a business registration listed in Delaware, which Bud had already told me was a common choice for entities that wanted maximum privacy and minimum disclosure requirements. A listed address that, when I searched it on a mapping application, resolved to a commercial mailbox service in Wilmington, not an office. A mailbox, the company's stated purpose in its formation documents, which were part of the public record, was listed as Management Consulting and Financial Advisory Services. Vague enough to mean almost anything. There was a website, sparse, a landing page with a logo, a simple geometric design, dark blue, and 3 lines of text describing the company as a boutique advisory firm serving select clients in the Midwest region. No staff listed, no client testimonials, no contact form, just a generic email address and a phone number that, when I tried it, rang 4 times and went to a voicemail that gave only the company name. I dug into the state filing records, and there, in a 9-year-old formation document filed with the state of Delaware, I found the list of registered directors. 3 names. The first 2 meant nothing to me. Common names, no context I could attach to them, Mom. The third name stopped my hand on the mouse. Carol Ann Whitfield. I read it 3 times. Her maiden name. Her exact maiden name, middle name included, in a document filed 9 years ago with a shell company I had never heard of, whose registered address was a mailbox in Wilmington, Delaware, whose representative drove to a diner in Kellerton, Ohio on Tuesday evenings to receive sealed envelopes from my wife. I pushed back from the desk. I walked to the kitchen. I stood at the counter. I poured a glass of water and drank it without tasting it. I thought about Bud's words from our first conversation, the one you don't want it to be. This was the one I didn't want it to be. Carol was not a passive participant in whatever this was. She was not someone who had been pulled into something against her will, or seduced into a bad situation, or caught up in someone else's scheme through bad luck or poor judgment. Her name was on a formation document. You do not accidentally end up as a registered director of a shell company. You sign paperwork, you present identification, you make a choice. 9 years ago, Carol Ann Whitfield had made a choice. I called Bud and told him what I had found. The line was quiet for a long moment after I finished. Then he said, "Ray, I need you to hear me carefully. This is bigger than I thought it was. This is not a personal matter anymore. I think you need to come see me in person, not on the phone, in person." I asked him when. He said, "Today. I want to stop here and ask you something directly. Because I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking, why didn't he just confront her? Why didn't he walk into that bedroom and ask her, point blank, what her name was doing on a shell company document? And the honest answer is this: because I was afraid. Not of Carol, but of what the answer would mean. Because once she told me the truth, and I knew somehow that she would tell me the truth if I asked her directly. Carol was never a skilled liar to my face. Once I heard it out loud, the life I had known for 32 years would be over. I wasn't ready for it to be over yet. But ready or not, what Bud was about to show me at his kitchen table that afternoon was going to take that choice away from me completely. Bud lived about 20 minutes from our house in a ranch-style home he had shared with his wife Margaret until she passed 4 years ago. He kept it neat, in the particular way of men who live alone and have military or law enforcement backgrounds. Not decorated, not warm exactly, but orderly. Everything in its place. A kitchen table that had clearly become a workspace, with a laptop and a legal pad and a cup of pens, a corkboard on the wall of the small room off the kitchen that he used as an office, still covered in the overlapping layers of notes and photographs from cases he had worked on over the years that he'd never quite gotten around to taking down. He had coffee ready when I arrived. He poured 2 cups without asking and set them on the kitchen table and sat down across from me. He had a legal pad in front of him with notes already on it. He had been working since I called him. "Before I show you what I found," he said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly." I told him, of course. "Is there any possibility, any at all, that you have a business relationship or a financial interest somewhere that you've forgotten about, or that was set up on your behalf without your full awareness? Anything your accountant handles, anything inherited, anything connected to your father's estate?" I told him no. My finances were simple and entirely managed by me. My father's estate had been settled years ago and had consisted of very little. A small house that was sold, a modest savings account, some personal effects. There was nothing lingering from it. Bud nodded slowly and wrote something on the legal pad. "Okay," he said. "Then let me show you what I've got." He turned the laptop toward me. He had been doing what he called a corporate thread pull, following the connections between Halcyon Consulting Group and any other registered entities that shared directors, registered agents, or addresses. It was the kind of methodical cross-referencing that public business records allowed if you knew how to navigate them and had the patience to follow the threads. What he had found was not one company. It was a network of them. Halcyon Consulting Group LLC was connected, through shared registered agents and overlapping director names, to 4 other entities. The names were similar in character: anodyne, professional sounding, meaningless without context. A property management company registered in Nevada, a financial services firm in Wyoming, a logistics consultancy in Delaware, a small investment vehicle in Ohio, the only one with a state connection to where we actually lived. Each entity had been formed at different times over roughly a 14-year window. The Ohio investment vehicle was the oldest. It had been formed 15 years ago. "Here's the thing about shell company networks," Bud said, leaning forward with his coffee cup. "On their own, they're not illegal. Plenty of legitimate businesses use layered corporate structures for liability reasons, tax reasons, privacy reasons. But when you start looking at what flows through them, what money goes in and what money comes out and where it goes, that's where you find out what they're really for." I asked him if he could find out what flowed through these entities. He said, "Not with public records alone, but here's what I can tell you from what's visible. 3 of these 5 companies have been administratively dissolved, meaning they stopped filing required reports and the states canceled their registrations. That happens with legitimate businesses sometimes, but it happens more often with entities that served a specific purpose for a specific period and were then abandoned when that purpose was complete." I asked him what purpose. He said, "That's the question, but here's what I want you to look at." He pointed to a line on the screen. One of the dissolved entities, the Nevada Property Management Company, had a registered agent that also appeared in the public records of a regional insurance company that had been the subject of a state regulatory investigation approximately 12 years ago. The investigation had been closed without prosecution, which Bud said was not unusual. These things were often closed, not because nothing was found, but because the evidence was insufficient or the cooperation of witnesses was unavailable. "What was the insurance company investigated for?" I asked. Bud looked at me steadily. "Premium fraud. Specifically, a scheme involving inflated claims on commercial property policies. Somebody was filing claims for the losses that either hadn't occurred or had been significantly exaggerated. The money was paid out by the insurer, and then it moved, through a series of transactions, into what the investigators believed were privately held entities. They could never fully prove where it ended up because the trail went cold at the corporate layer." I sat with that for a moment. "How much money?" I asked. Bud said, "The investigation estimated somewhere between $2 and $4 million over the active period. They were never precise because they could never baflisirichantatos disa transaction. $2 to $4 million. I picked up my coffee cup and set it back down without drinking from it. "Bud," I said, "Carol's maiden name is on the Halcyon formation document. She's a registered director. If Halcyon is connected to this, if this network of companies is connected to an insurance fraud investigation, what does that mean for her?" Bud was quiet for a moment. He had the look of someone choosing their words with care. "It means," he said slowly, "that she was connected, at least on paper, to an entity that sits in the same corporate network as a company that was investigated for significant financial fraud. That is not proof of personal involvement. Corporate directorship can sometimes be nominal. Someone's name put on a document as a formality, sometimes without full understanding of what the entity is actually used for." "But," I said, because there was clearly a but. "But," he said, "the cash withdrawals you described, the burner phone, the meetings in Kellerton, the envelope passed at that diner, those are not nominal. Those are active. Whatever the connection was 9 years ago when Halcyon was formed, it is not historical. It is ongoing. I stood up from the table and walked to Bud's kitchen window. Outside, his backyard was bare and brown in the November light. A bird feeder hung from the oak tree near the fence, empty. "What kind of person," I said, not really directing the question at Bud, "maintains a connection to something like this for 9 years? For 15 years, if the Ohio company is the starting point? What kind of person does that while living a normal life? While raising children, working at a library, going to book club on Tuesday evenings?" Bud didn't answer immediately. Then he said quietly, "Someone who was in it before the normal life started. Someone for whom the normal life was built around the other thing, not the other way around." I turned away from the window. I thought about 1991, a fundraiser for a literacy program, a woman reading the back of a book, a first dinner at an Italian restaurant where she ordered badly, but with tremendous confidence. I thought, what was already in motion by then? The Ohio Investment Vehicle, the oldest entity in the network, had been formed 15 years ago. Carol and I had been married for 17 years by that point. It had started 2 years into our marriage. But if the corporate network was built over a 14-year window, if the Ohio company was the foundation and Halcyon came 9 years later, then the beginning of whatever this was predated the first company formation. The infrastructure came after the operation was already running, which meant, "Bud," I said, "when did the insurance investigation timeline start? The actual fraud, not the investigation?" He checked his notes. Regulators estimated the scheme was active for approximately 6 to 8 years before the investigation was opened. So starting somewhere around 18 to 20 years ago. 18 to 20 years ago. Derek had been 2 or 3 years old. Nina wasn't born yet. We had just moved to Harwick. My mind went to the bank records I had pulled. The cash withdrawals that had started irregularly and grown more regular over the years. Not 18 months ago, not 3 years ago, further back than that, before the online records went. I sat back down at the table. "There's something else, Jamo," Bud said. He had been watching me process and had waited. "The man in your photographs from the diner." I ran the plate through a contact and got a name. I looked at him. The vehicle is registered to Halcyon Consulting Group, but the contact was able to get me a name associated with the account, the individual listed as the operating principal of the company currently. He paused. "The name is Garrett Pruitt." I heard the name and did not immediately understand it. Then I understood it. Pruitt. My name. My family name. "That's not a coincidence," I said. I said. My voice sounded strange to me. Far away. "No," Bud said. "It's not." I asked him if he could find out anything else about this person, Garrett Pruitt, who he was, where he came from. Bud said he would try. He told me again to be careful. He told me not to confront Carol yet, and not to do anything that would suggest to anyone that I was digging. He walked me to the door and put his hand on my shoulder for a moment, in the way that men of our generation express things they don't have easy words for. I drove home in the early dark of a November afternoon. Garrett Pruitt. A man with my last name. A name that was not a common one. Operating a shell company that my wife was a registered director of. Meeting with her in a diner 40 miles from our home. Receiving sealed envelopes from her. Connected to of entities worth millions of dollars. And a voice on a phone that had said my name before I said a word. "Raymond, don't hang up." He had known it would be me. He had known because Carol had told him, or because he had always known it was possible that someday Raymond would find the phone. He had known my name because he already knew who I was. The question that was consuming me as I pulled into my driveway and sat in the dark car looking at the lit windows of my house, was not what is he to Carol. It was, what is he to me? I need to pause here because I know exactly what you're feeling right now. You're running through the possibilities the same way I was. A business partner, a handler, someone from Carol's past that I never knew about. And some of you have already landed on the one possibility that hadn't fully formed in my mind yet, but was getting closer with every piece of information I found. Because there was one more thing I hadn't discovered yet. One more door I hadn't opened. It was in a storage unit on the edge of town, behind a corrugated metal door, inside a filing box that smelled like dust and old paper. And what was in that box was going to change everything I thought I knew. Not just about Carol, not just about Halcyon, but about my father, about how he died, and about who I actually was. I found the key on a Thursday. Carol had a winter coat, a long charcoal gray wool coat that she had owned for years, hanging in the back of our bedroom closet. She rarely wore it. It had been pushed to the far end of the hanging rod behind the things she used regularly, half hidden behind a garment bag and a collection of scarves on a hook. I had not touched that coat in years. I am not sure I had thought about it in years. I was not looking for it specifically. I was doing something that I had begun doing every day since finding the phone, a quiet, systematic examination of the spaces in our home that I had never had reason to examine before. Not tearing things apart, not leaving signs of disturbance, just looking, the way you look when you are finally paying attention. I went through the coat's pockets the way I had gone through everything else, methodically, without expectation. In the right exterior pocket, a receipt from a drugstore, years old, for cold medicine and chapstick. In the left exterior pocket, a folded tissue and 2 pennies. In the interior breast pocket, a key. It was a small standard key of the type used for padlocks and storage units. A flat brass key with a round head, the number 114 stamped into the head in small digits. There was no tag, no label, no identifying information beyond the number. I held it in my palm for a moment. Then I put it in my own pocket, replaced everything else exactly as it had been, and closed the closet. I spent that evening behaving normally. Dinner, television, conversation. The whole architecture of a regular Thursday night that I had constructed and maintained with increasing deliberateness over the past 2 weeks. Carol seemed entirely herself. That was the thing I kept coming back to. She seemed entirely, completely herself. Warm, present, mildly funny in the way she always was, interested in small things, easy to be with. The woman I had been married to for 32 years, sitting across from me eating pasta, asking if I thought we should call Nina this weekend. I said yes, we should call Nina this weekend. After she went to sleep, I lay in the dark thinking about storage unit, key number 114, and which storage facility it might belong to. There were 3 self-storage businesses within reasonable distance of Harwick. I had thought about this while we ate dinner and watched television, running the geography in my head while appearing to pay attention to a home renovation program. The nearest facility was about 2 miles from the house, on the commercial road heading north. The second was on the outskirts of town, near the old industrial area to the east. The third was in a small commercial cluster about 8 miles south, closer to the highway. The next morning, after Carol left for the library, I drove to all 3. The first facility, the one 2 miles north, used a digital keypad entry system and unit-specific electronic locks. No padlocks. Not this one. The second facility used padlocks. I drove slowly through the rows and found Unit 114 in the second block of the eastern section. The padlock on the door was a standard brass model consistent with the key in my pocket. I parked. I sat for a moment. Then I walked to Unit 114 and put the key in the lock. It turned. The unit was small, a 5x10 space, the kind used for overflow storage, not large items. It was not full. Along the right wall there were 3 cardboard boxes, uniform in size, the kind used for file storage. They were sealed with packing tape. There was a folding chair leaning against the left wall and a small plastic tote near the door containing what appeared to be cleaning supplies. A roll of paper towels, a spray bottle, rubber gloves. The cleaning supplies bothered me in a way I couldn't immediately articulate. They suggested that someone came here with enough regularity to want to be able to clean up, to leave no trace. I went to the filing boxes. The first box contained what appeared to be financial records, printed spreadsheets, some handwritten ledgers, a series of documents that I recognized as the format of insurance claim forms, though the specific identifying details had been redacted or removed. The numbers on these documents were significant. Claim amounts in the hundreds of thousands, multiple entries, spanning what appeared to be several years. This was the operational record of something large and deliberate. I photographed every page. The second box contained correspondence, printed emails, some handwritten letters, a collection of what appeared to be internal communications within a small organization. Names appeared throughout, but I did not recognize most of them. I was moving quickly, photographing methodically, and I made note of the names I could capture clearly to research later. The third box was different. The third box had a piece of paper taped to the inside of the lid, handwritten. The handwriting was not Carol's. It read, simply, R, for when the time comes. I stared at that for a long moment. R. Raymond. For when the time comes. Someone had left this for me, or had intended to leave it for me eventually, under some set of circumstances I didn't yet understand. This box had been prepared with my discovery in mind. Inside the third box were 3 items. The first was a manila envelope containing a series of photographs. Old photographs printed on the kind of photo paper that was common in the late 90s and early 2000s. They showed a man I recognized, my father, Gerald Pruitt, younger than I mostly remembered him in settings I didn't recognize. He was with other people in most of the photographs, at tables, in parking lots, in what appeared to be an office. The other people meant nothing to me, but I photographed the photographs carefully. The second item was a bound document, the kind produced by a copy shop, spiral bound with a clear plastic cover. On the cover page was typed, Summary of Material Facts, Gerald H. Pruitt, prepared for internal reference. I opened it. It was approximately 40 pages. I did not have time to read it in the unit. I photographed every page. The third item stopped me completely. It was a single sheet of paper, unfolded, printed on plain white stock. At the top was a name and a date of birth. The name was Garrett Allen Pruitt. The date of birth was in 1964, which would make him 61 or 62 years old currently, consistent with what I had observed at the diner. Below the name and date of birth was a short paragraph of text. And below that paragraph were 2 things, a DNA test result summary, and a handwritten note in the margin that read, Confirmed paternal half-sibling match. I read the paragraph above the DNA summary. It stated in plain and clinical language that Garrett Allen Pruitt was the biological son of Gerald Howard Pruitt, born of a relationship prior to Gerald Pruitt's first marriage. that Garrett had been given up for adoption at birth and had located his biological father through a private genealogical service in the mid-90s. That contact had been established between Garrett and Gerald Pruitt in 1996, that this contact had remained unknown to Gerald Pruitt's family. Derek had been born in 1996. I had been 34 years old, working long hours, distracted with a new baby and a new town, and the particular exhaustion of early parenthood. My father had come to visit us that year. I remembered it vaguely. He had seemed different somehow during that visit, quieter than usual, but I had attributed it to age and to the natural emotional weight of becoming a grandfather. He had been meeting his secret son. My father had a son I never knew about, an older son, older than me by 5 years, born before his first marriage to a woman I knew nothing about, given up for adoption, grown into a man who had found his biological father and made contact and kept the whole thing invisible from me for the rest of my father's life. I sat down on the floor of that storage unit. My father died in April of 2011. A heart attack, the death certificate said. He had been 74 years old. He had a history of cardiac issues. It had been sad and hard, but not shocking. Not at the time. I turned back to the bound document. Even in my stunned state, I had the presence of mind to keep photographing. I was moving through the pages as fast as I could, capturing everything. Near the back of the bound document, around page 35, there was a section titled Events of March to April 2011. I stopped photographing and read it directly. The section described a deterioration in the relationship between Gerald Pruitt and Garrett Pruitt in the early months of 2011. It described Gerald becoming uncomfortable with the direction the financial operation had taken. The language was careful and indirect, but it was clearly referring to the insurance fraud scheme. It described Gerald expressing a desire to disengage and, critically, expressing concern about what he called exposure to his family, meaning me, meaning my family. It described Gerald indicating that he intended to speak to his son Raymond. And then it described Gerald's death in April 2011, and then, in language that was careful enough to be deniable but clear enough to be unmistakable if you were reading it with the right understanding. It described the steps taken to ensure that Gerald's cardiac event was not investigated as anything other than natural causes, and the individuals involved in ensuring that outcome. I am 61 years old. I have not cried easily since I was a young man. I sat on the floor of that storage unit, and I put my face in my hands. My father had not died of a heart attack, or rather, perhaps his heart had stopped, but it had been helped to stop by people who needed him to stop talking, stop worrying, stop wanting to tell his son the truth about what he had been involved in. And Carol had known, not from the beginning. The document made that clear. She had been told in 2013, 2 years after my father's death, by Garrett himself. The document described a meeting between Garrett and Carol in which he had told her what had happened to Gerald and had made clear, in terms that the document did not spell out but that I understood completely, that Carol's continued cooperation and silence were expected. That the alternative was that I would be told, and that what I was told would include Carol's own involvement in the financial operation going back to the late 90s. She had been trapped. I sat with that for a long time. She had been recruited into something in the late 90s, probably when Derek was a baby, and I was working long hours and not paying attention. And by the time she understood the full nature of what she was involved in, she was already in it too deep to extract herself cleanly. And then my father had died, and Garrett had used that knowledge as a lever, and she had been paying him, meeting him, passing him envelopes in a diner in Kellerton for 12 years. Not because she wanted to, because she was terrified. I thought about the woman asleep in our bed. I thought about 32 years of marriage. I thought about the vanilla candle and the oak tree and the photograph from Derek's rehearsal dinner. I thought about my father, about the way he had seemed different during that visit in 1996, about the last time I had seen him, at Christmas 2010, 4 months before he died. He had been quiet. He had hugged me for a long time when I left. I had thought he was just getting old. He had been trying to figure out how to tell me. I replaced everything in the third box exactly as I had found it. I closed the box. I put the key back in my pocket and left the storage unit and locked it behind me. I drove to a park 2 miles away and sat in the parking lot and called Bud. When he answered, I said, "I need you to listen to me very carefully, all of it, and then I need you to tell me who I call. I know this is a lot to absorb. I know some of you are sitting with this right now the way I sat with it in that parking lot, trying to make the pieces fit, trying to hold the whole picture at once. A shell company, a fraud scheme, a half-brother I never knew existed, a father who didn't die the way I was told, and Carol? Carol, who had known for 12 years and had carried it beside me every single day. I want to ask you something honestly. If you were in my position, if you discovered that the person you loved had been keeping a secret like this, not out of malice but out of fear, what would you feel? Anger? Grief? Both at once? Because I felt both, at the same time, with equal force. And what happened next, within 48 hours of that phone call to Bud, was about to make everything significantly more dangerous. There is a moment in certain kinds of crisis. I have heard other people describe it, and I experienced it myself that afternoon in the park parking lot, where the emotional weight of what you have discovered becomes temporarily secondary to the immediate practical reality of your situation. Some survival mechanism in the brain shifts the processing, sets the grief aside, says, "That is for later." Right now you need to think clearly. I was grateful for that mechanism. I needed it. I sat in that parking lot for nearly an hour with Bud on the phone. I told him everything. From the beginning, in order, holding nothing back, the storage unit, the 3 boxes, the photographs of my father, the bound document and what it described, the third box and the note written for me, the DNA summary, Garrett Pruitt and his date of birth, and what the document said about his relationship to my father, and what the document said about April of 2011. Bud listened to all of it without interrupting. I had sent him photographs from my phone as I talked, the pages of the bound document, the financial records from the first box, the DNA summary. I could hear him opening them on his end, the faint sounds of him moving through the images while I talked. When I finished, there was a silence that lasted long enough that I checked the phone to make sure the call hadn't dropped. Then Bud said, "Ray, I want you to go directly home. Don't stop anywhere. Don't make any other calls. When you get home, act completely normally. And tonight, after Carol goes to sleep, I need you to make copies of every photograph you took in that unit and send them to an email address I'm going to give you. Not your regular email. I want you to set up a new one on your phone right now, something with no connection to your name. Can you do that?" I told him I could. "Good. I'm going to make a call this afternoon. I have a former colleague. She left the sheriff's department about 6 years ago, went federal. She owes me a conversation. I'm not going to tell her everything yet. I'm going to tell her enough to find out if what you've described matches anything that's already on a radar somewhere. Because something this structured, something that's been running this long, it does not exist in a total vacuum. Somebody somewhere has been watching some part of this. I want to know if your father's death is part of an open question anywhere." I asked him what he meant by open question. He said, "I mean that sometimes when investigations go cold, the questions don't go away. They just sit. And sometimes new information is exactly what's needed to reopen them. If what that document describes is accurate, if your father's death was not natural, then there may already be people who suspected that and couldn't prove it. Your photographs may change that." I drove home. I made dinner. I sent the photographs from my new anonymous email account. I watched a nature program with Carol that I could not have described 30 seconds after it ended. I said goodnight and went to bed and lay in the dark and waited. The first sign that something had shifted came 2 days later. It was a Saturday morning. I had gotten up early, as I usually did, and was in the kitchen with my coffee when I noticed a car parked on the opposite side of our street, about 4 houses down. A dark-colored sedan, not a model I recognized as belonging to any of our neighbors. It had been there when I came downstairs just after 6. It was still there at 8:15 when Carol came down for breakfast. It was gone by 9. I noted it, but did not react. People park on streets. Cars belong to visitors. I told myself that and mostly believed it, and went about my Saturday. Sunday morning, the same car was back. Different position. 3 houses down on the same side as our house rather than opposite. Same dark sedan. I could not make out the occupant clearly from the kitchen window, but there was someone in the driver's seat. At 10:15, it was gone again. I called Bud. He said, "I was going to call you this morning. My contact came back to me yesterday. I can't tell you specifics yet because she wasn't specific with me. She was careful about what she said on the phone. But the short version is that what you've described is not unknown to certain people. She wants to meet in person. She wants to see the photographs. I told her I'd set it up for next week." I told him about the car. He went quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How many times?" I told him 2 mornings, same vehicle, slightly different position. He said, "That's positioning. That's someone establishing your routine. Learning when you're in the house, when you're not, who comes and goes." He paused. "Ray, I need you to think carefully. Has anything changed in the last week that might have signaled to anyone that you've been digging? Any behavior on your part that was different? Any searches on a device that could be monitored? Any conversations that weren't on your secure line?" I thought carefully. And then I thought about something that turned my blood cold. 3 days ago, I had used our home Wi-Fi network to do some of my research. I had been in my office using my laptop. The same laptop I used for everything, connected to our home network, the network that Carol also used, the network whose router sat in the hallway outside the kitchen. I had been searching Halcyon Consulting Group. I had been accessing Delaware business records. I had been looking at the insurance investigation documents that were in the public record. On our shared home network, I told Bud. Another silence. Longer this time. "Okay," he said, with the particular flatness in his voice that I had come to recognize as the sound of him being very controlled about something that concerned him. "Here's what I need you to do. Starting today, all research, all communication about this, everything, goes through your phone on cellular data only. Not the home Wi-Fi. Not your laptop unless it's on a completely separate network. If someone connected to Carol's operation has any kind of monitoring on that home network, and I'm not saying they do, I'm saying it's possible, then they may have seen your search activity." I asked him how likely that was. He said, "I don't know, but the car appearing after your search activity is not a timing I'm comfortable with." I was not comfortable with it either. The text message came on Monday evening. I was in my office, phone on the desk, when it arrived from a number I didn't recognize. 11 digits, formatted like a phone number, but with an area code I couldn't place. The message was 6 words. You've seen enough. Walk away now. I stared at it for a long time. Then I took a screenshot and forwarded it to Bud's number and to the anonymous email account and sat very still in my office chair listening to the sounds of the house. The refrigerator cycling in the kitchen, the furnace, Carol moving around upstairs. I could hear her footsteps, the sound of the bathroom faucet. Bud called me within 4 minutes of receiving the screenshot. "That's a warning," he said. "Not a threat. Not yet. A warning. Whoever sent that wants you to make a choice on your own so that they don't have to escalate. That means they're not sure yet how much you know, and they'd prefer to contain this without direct action." I asked him what direct action meant. He said, "It means they'd rather you walk away than have to do something about you. Which means as long as you appear to walk away, you buy time." He paused. "Ray, I need you out of that house. Not permanently, not dramatically. Just for a few days while I get the meeting with my contact arranged. Do you have somewhere you can go that wouldn't seem unusual?" I thought about Derek, 40 minutes away. I could tell him I wanted to spend a few days, help him with something around the apartment. He wouldn't question it. Derek was easy that way, accommodating, always glad to have company. I told Bud I could go to my son's place. He said, "Good. Go tomorrow. Pack a normal bag, tell Carol something ordinary, and go." I asked him, should I tell Derek anything? He said, "Tell him nothing yet. The fewer people who know what's actually happening, the safer everyone is, including him." I told Carol over dinner that evening that I was thinking of going to spend a few days with Derek. I said I had been feeling restless since semi-retiring, and that spending time with him always helped. She looked up from her plate with an expression I analyzed carefully and found to be genuine warmth. She said she thought that was a lovely idea. She said to tell Derek she sent her love. I watched her face for any flicker of something else, any calculation behind the warmth. I did not find it, which meant either she had no idea I was leaving for any reason other than what I had said, or she was far better at this than I had ever understood. I packed a bag the next morning after she left for the library. Normal things, clothes for a few days, my toiletries, a book I had been meaning to read. I loaded the car. I drove to Derek's. Derek was glad to see me. He had a 2-bedroom apartment in a town called Millfield. Clean, modestly furnished, the apartment of a young man who was organized, but not yet fully settled. He cooked dinner that first evening, a chicken dish he was proud of, and we sat at his small table and talked about his work. He was in supply chain logistics, a job he was good at and found genuinely interesting, and about Nina, and about an old film I had recommended to him that he had finally watched. It was, in its way, a relief to be somewhere outside the walls of that house, to have a meal where I was not performing normalcy while internally cataloging surveillance vehicles and text message timestamps. On the second evening, my phone rang. It was Carol. She asked how I was, how Derek was, whether I was sleeping better away from home. I told her yes, I was sleeping better. She told me she missed me. I told her I'd be back in a few days. After we hung up, I sat on Derek's couch for a long time. Then Derek came out of the kitchen with 2 cups of coffee and sat down in the chair across from me and said carefully, "Dad, I talked to Mom this afternoon." I looked at him. He said, "She called me. She asked how you were, whether you seemed okay. She said you'd been seeming distracted lately, not quite yourself." He paused. "I told her you seemed fine to me. I told her you were relaxed and good to have around." He paused again, looking at his coffee cup. "I may have mentioned you'd been at my place since yesterday." The thing I had been afraid of. Carol knew I was at Derek's. I kept my expression neutral. I told Derek his mother worried too much and that everything was fine. He nodded, not entirely convinced, but not pushing. That night, after Derek went to bed, I called Bud. He said, "She knows you are out of the house, which means she may start to suspect you're not there because you're visiting Derek. She may start to put things together about what you know." I told him I thought he was right. I told him I thought we were running out of time. He said, "My contact can meet us Thursday, 2 days. Can you hold it together for 2 more days?" I told him I could, but I was lying, a little. Because the truth was that sitting in my son's apartment, drinking coffee on his couch, thinking about Carol and Garrett and my father, and a car parked on my street, and a text message that told me I had seen enough, the truth was that I was no longer afraid of them. I was angry. The kind of anger that comes after grief has had its first say. The kind that clarifies rather than clouds. The kind that makes a 61-year-old man who has spent his whole life being measured and methodical and careful decide that careful has its limits. I had been patient. I had followed the rules. I had done everything Bud told me to do. But my father was dead. Helped into that death by people who needed his silence. And the woman sleeping in my bed had known about it for 12 years and had sat across from me every single day and said nothing. I was done waiting. I want to stop here and ask you something, because I think a lot of you watching this and especially those of you who have been in situations where someone held back a truth from you to protect themselves. I think you understand exactly the kind of anger I'm describing. It's not hot anger, it's cold. It's the anger that comes with clarity. And I need to ask you, what would you have done at this point? Would you have waited the 2 days? Would you have trusted the process? Or would you have gotten in your car and driven home and looked your wife in the eyes and demanded the truth right then? Tell me in the comments. Because the choice I made in the next 48 hours, the thing I decided to do before Bud's Thursday meeting, that is what made the confrontation happen the way it did. And the confrontation, when it came, was nothing like I expected. I did not wait until Thursday. I know that is what Bud had asked me to do. I know it was the rational choice, the measured choice, the choice consistent with everything I had told myself about being methodical and patient and not moving before I understood the full picture. I had given myself those instructions clearly and deliberately, and I broke them anyway. Because on Wednesday morning, Derek went to work, and I sat alone in his apartment with my coffee and my phone, and the photographs I had taken in the storage unit. And I thought about my phone hugging me for a long time at Christmas 2010, and I thought about April 2011, and I thought about 32 years, and I thought about Carol sitting across from me every single day for 12 years, knowing what she knew. And I called her, not to confront her, not yet. I called her the way I always called her when I was away from home, casually, mid-morning, just to check in. She answered on the second ring, warm and normal, asked how I had slept, asked if Derek had made his good chicken again. I said yes. I said I was thinking about coming home tomorrow instead of Friday, if that was all right with her. She said, of course, she missed me, come home whenever I wanted. I said, Carol, I'd like to meet somewhere first, before I come home. Just the two of us, somewhere we can talk. I was thinking that diner on Millfield Road, the one near the hardware store. Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. There was a pause. Not a long one. Perhaps 3 seconds. But I had been married to this woman for 32 years, and I knew every rhythm of her speech and her silence. And that pause was not the pause of someone trying to check their schedule or remember if they had a commitment. It was the pause of someone recalibrating. Of course, she said. Her voice was even. Is everything all right? I just want to talk, I said. 9 o'clock. I'll be there, she said. I called Bud immediately after and told him what I had done. He was not pleased. He told me I was moving too fast, that we didn't have the federal meeting in place yet, that I was potentially giving Carol the opportunity to call Garrett and coordinate before the meeting. I told him I understood all of that. I told him that I was 61 years old, and that this was my marriage and my father, and that I needed to look her in the face and hear it from her directly, whatever it was, before lawyers and federal contacts and case files made it into something that belonged to other people. Bud was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right, but I want to be nearby. Not in the diner. Outside. And Ray, I need you to promise me something. Whatever she tells you, whatever she says, you do not react in any way that escalates the situation physically or that causes a scene that puts either of you in the position of drawing attention. You listen. You ask questions. You come back to me." I promised him. He said, "And wear your phone in your breast pocket with the voice memo running. Not for legal purposes. It won't be admissible in any useful way. But so you have a record of what was said that isn't just your memory." I told him I would. I arrived at the Millfield Road Diner at 8:45. It was a gray November morning, the sky the color of old pewter, the kind of cold that doesn't bite but simply settles into everything. The diner parking lot was half full with the late morning coffee crowd. Retired men, a young mother with a stroller, a pair of workers in high-visibility vests at the counter. I chose a booth near the back, away from the windows. The same instinct Carol had shown at the Millstone in Kellerton. I ordered coffee and sat with my hands around the cup and waited. Carol arrived at 9:01. She was wearing her gray coat, not the charcoal winter coat from the back of the closet, but her everyday gray, and her hair was down the way she wore it when she wasn't working. She looked, walking through that diner toward me, exactly like the woman I had been married to for 32 years. The same walk, the same slight tilt of the head, the same expression of careful composure that I had always read as simply her nature. Calm, measured, unhurried. I read it differently now. She sat down across from me and ordered a coffee from the server without taking her eyes fully off me. When the server left, she folded her hands on the table. "Raymond," she said. "Carol," I said. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The diner sounds filled the space between us. The clink of cups, a brief burst of laughter from the counter, the low murmur of other people's mornings. Then she said, very quietly, "How much do you know?" I looked at her. Everything," I said. "Or close enough to everything that the gaps don't matter anymore." She closed her eyes. Not dramatically, just a brief closing, like someone absorbing a physical impact, and then she opened them again. They were wet, not spilling over, not yet, but wet in the way that means the effort of holding it back is already underway. "The phone," she said. "The phone," I said, "and the storage unit, and Halcyon, and Garrett." The name landed visibly. Her jaw tightened slightly and then released. "And my father?" I said. She put one hand over her mouth, just briefly, just for a moment. Then she put it back down on the table. "Raymond," she said, I need you to tell me the truth," I said. "Not what you need me to know. The truth. All of it. From the beginning." She looked at me for a long moment, and then she nodded. One small, definitive nod. And she told me. It had started in 1998. Carol had been approached. That was the word she used initially. Approached. And I noted it. The passivity of it. Before she corrected herself and said, "I was approached, and I said yes." It had been through a woman she knew peripherally. A contact from her graduate school years who had stayed loosely in touch. This woman had described what she called a consulting opportunity: administrative work, document handling, some light financial record-keeping for a small business group. The pay was good. We were in the lean years then, Derek just 2 years old, my engineering firm having a difficult stretch. Carol said she had not asked enough questions. She said she had told herself it was legitimate because it was presented as legitimate, and because she had needed the money and had not wanted to examine it too closely. Within a year, she understood it was not legitimate. By that point, she was already a registered director on a company formation document, had already processed payments she understood to be fraudulent, and had already received compensation that she had hidden from our joint finances. She said she tried to stop. She said the woman who had recruited her made clear that stopping was not a straightforward option, that Carol's name was on documents, that her involvement was documented, that if she withdrew and caused problems, the documentation would find its way to the relevant people. She had been 29 years old. We had a 2-year-old son, and I was working 60 hours a week, and she was managing everything at home, and she had been frightened and had made a calculation that she would regret for the rest of her life. She stayed in it. For years, the involvement was minimal: periodic document handling, the cash withdrawals, which she confirmed, every detail of what I had found, with a terrible precision that told me she had been carrying this accounting in her head for decades. Small tasks, enough to maintain her usefulness to the operation and keep her name protected, but not enough to consume her life. She said she had never met my father's other son until 2009. Garrett had reached out to her directly in the fall of that year. He had known who she was. Her involvement in the financial network had been known to the people running it, of which Garrett was by then a significant figure. He had wanted to establish a direct relationship with her, he said, to simplify the communication chain. She had agreed to meet him. They had met at the Millstone Diner in Kellerton for the first time. Carol paused here, looking at her coffee cup. I waited. She said, "He told me about your father in 2013, 2 years after Gerald died. He told me as I don't know what to call it, a demonstration. He told me so I would understand what I was connected to and what the people involved were capable of." She looked up at me. I don't think he expected me to feel the way I felt. I think he thought it would just make me compliant. And it did make me compliant, but not in the way he expected. I was devastated. Raymond, I want you to know that. I was devastated. You didn't tell me, I said. No, she said, for 12 years. Yes. I looked at her across that table for a long time. The thing about a moment like that, the thing that is almost impossible to explain to someone who hasn't experienced it, is how quiet it is. You expect it to be loud. You expect the floor to drop out. Instead, it is very quiet and very still, and the ordinary world keeps going around you. The clink of cups, the murmur of conversation, someone at the counter asking for a refill, and you are sitting in the middle of it, holding something so heavy you cannot imagine how you will carry it home. I asked her about the envelopes at the Millstone. What was in them? She said, cash mostly, sometimes documents. Garrett maintained the fiction horse that the cash was operational, that it was legitimate consulting fees paid outside the normal channels. It wasn't. It was my continued buy-in, my continued demonstration of loyalty. $200 every 2 weeks was not significant money for an operation at that scale. It was symbolic. It was him reminding me regularly that I was still in it. I asked her about the name Marcus. She said Marcus was a real person, an associate of Garrett's who handled some of the document logistics. She had spoken to him occasionally. He was not someone I would ever encounter, she said, but his name was in the operation. I asked her about the phone call, the man who had said my name. She said, "That was Garrett. He must have called when I was at book club. He has only ever used that number to reach me. He knew your name because I had told him years ago that if the phone was ever found, it would likely be found by you." She said that quietly, without drama, as a plain fact. I sat with that. "He called and said my name," I said, "as a test, to see what I would do." "Yes," she said, "and when I hung up, he told you. He told me you had found the phone. He told me to assess whether you had done anything with what you found. I told him you hadn't seemed different." She paused. I was wrong. A silence. "Carol," I said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me with total honesty. Did you want out? Not 12 years ago when he told you about my father. Now, did you want out of this?" She looked at me with something in her expression that I hadn't seen there before. Not the composure I was used to. Something raw. "Raymond," she said, "I have wanted out of this since 1999. I have wanted out of this every single day for 25 years. I have spent 25 years not knowing how to get out without destroying everything. Without destroying you and Derek and Nina and our life and your father's memory, and everything I had spent 25 years trying to protect, even while being part of the thing that was threatening it." She stopped. Her voice had cracked slightly on the last few words. I said nothing. She said, "I know that isn't enough. I know wanting out and staying in for 25 years is not a distinction you can be asked to honor. I know what I did. I know what I didn't do. I know what it cost. I am not asking you to forgive me today or perhaps ever. I need you to know that I knew it was wrong every day, every single day, and that I am so sorry about your father. Raymond, I am so profoundly sorry." I sat with that for a long time. Then I said, "I need you to help me now. I need you to be willing to tell the truth, to the right people formally, with documentation. I have someone I need you to speak to. It will mean Garrett knows you've turned. It will mean things get complicated and possibly dangerous before they get better. But I need to know if you'll do it." She didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said, "I'll do it." I called Bud Chamot from the parking lot. I told him how it had gone. I told him Carol was willing to cooperate. He said he would call his federal contact immediately and push the Thursday meeting to that afternoon, if possible. I went back inside and sat with Carol for another hour. We did not talk about the marriage. We did not talk about what happened after. That was not the conversation for that morning. The conversation for that morning was about documents, about what she knew, about names and dates, and the paper trail that still existed in that storage unit, and in Carol's memory, and in the 12 years of meticulous mental accounting she had been keeping about everything Garrett had told her and shown her and asked. She was precise. She was clear. She had, it turned out, been keeping her own private record, not on paper, not anywhere that could be found, but in her memory. Names, dates, amounts, locations, the things she had told herself she would remember in case the day ever came when she needed to remember them. She had been waiting for this day. For 25 years, she had been quietly, privately, keeping a record and waiting for the day when keeping it would matter. I thought about what kind of strength that required. What kind of terrible, exhausting, isolating strength. I did not tell her that. Not that morning, but I thought it. Bud's federal contact. A woman named Diane who had indeed gone from county detective work to a position in a federal financial crimes unit, met with us that evening at Bud's kitchen table. She was 52, composed, and had the particular quality of attention that serious investigators develop, the ability to listen to everything and react to nothing until she had heard it all. She looked at the photographs from the storage unit for a long time. She asked Carol a series of questions that were precise and non-emotional, the kind of questions that assume guilt as a baseline and work outward from there rather than backward from innocence. Carol answered all of them. At the end of the session, Diane sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she said, "The operation you've described is consistent with a pattern of activity that has been partially visible to federal investigators for approximately 6 years. We have had pieces. We have not had the center of it." She paused. "What you've given us tonight, the storage unit documentation, the corporate thread, the connection to the 2011 death, and your first-hand account as a participant. That's the center." She looked at Carol. "I want to be transparent with you about what cooperation means in this context. It means full disclosure. It means formal recorded statements. It means testifying if this goes to prosecution, which based on what I'm seeing, it will. It means that your own involvement will be part of the record." She paused. "In exchange for full cooperation, I can speak to prosecutors about consideration for your role. I cannot promise outcomes. I can tell you that the level of information you're offering and the duration of your involvement in a position that gave you access to significant operational detail makes your cooperation extremely valuable." Carol said, "I understand. I'll cooperate fully." Diane nodded. Then she looked at me. She said, "Mr. Pruitt, Raymond, I want you to know that the circumstances surrounding your father's death are going to be part of this investigation. I can't tell you today what that ultimately looks like legally, but I can tell you that it will not be ignored." I thanked her. Bud walked me out to my car afterward and stood in the cold driveway with his hands in his jacket pockets. He said, "You did the right thing, Ray." I told him I wasn't sure it felt like the right thing yet. He said, "It doesn't always, not right away." I drove back to Derek's apartment. I sat in the parking lot for a few minutes before going inside. The sky was very clear and very cold, and the stars were out with unusual brightness for a November night in Ohio. I thought about my father, about a man who had made bad choices and had wanted to undo them and had run out of time, about a son he never told me about, grown into someone who had turned a secret into a weapon, about 32 years and an oak tree and a photograph in golden evening light, about the person sleeping beside me every night for 3 decades who had been carrying all of it, alone, in silence, waiting for a day she wasn't sure would ever come. Within 48 hours of that evening, Garrett Pruitt and 2 associates were taken in for federal questioning. The Halcyon accounts were frozen, and a story that had been running in the dark beneath my life for 25 years finally came into the light. I want to ask you something before we get to the final part of this story, because I know what you're thinking about Carol. I know some of you are angry on my behalf, and I know some of you, maybe more of you than would say so out loud, feel something more complicated than anger, something closer to understanding. I want to ask you, where do you draw the line between victim and participant, between someone who was trapped and someone who chose to stay trapped because the alternative was too costly? I've spent 18 months sitting with that question. I'll tell you where I landed. In the final part of this story. 18 months. That is how long it took for the legal process to move from that evening at Bud's kitchen table to something resembling a conclusion. 18 months of depositions and federal interviews and document reviews and prosecutor meetings, and the particular grinding slowness of a system that moves at its own pace regardless of how urgently the people inside it need it to be finished. I want to tell you about those 18 months honestly, because this is not a story where justice arrives cleanly and quickly and everyone finds their footing and moves forward in an orderly way. That is not how it works. That is not how any of this works. What actually happens is messier and quieter and more exhausting than any dramatic version of events could prepare you for. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you what happened first. Garrett Pruitt was taken in for federal questioning on a Friday morning, 41 hours after Diane sat at Bud's kitchen table and looked at the photographs from the storage unit. I was not present for that. I was at Derek's apartment, drinking bad coffee and watching the clock, when Bud called me and said simply, "It's done. They have him." 2 associates were brought in the same morning. I did not know their names at the time. I learned them later. One was Marcus, whose name I had first heard Carol say in my kitchen over a year earlier, the man who had handled document logistics. The other was a financial intermediary, based in Delaware, who had managed the movement of money through the shell company network for the better part of a decade. Garrett did not cooperate initially. I was told this by Diane in a brief and carefully worded phone call. He had legal representation within hours and the early stages of the federal inquiry. Inquiry moved slowly, as these things do. But Carol's cooperation, her detailed, documented, memory-precise account of 12 years of direct contact with Garrett, combined with the physical documentation from the storage unit, gave investigators a foundation that did not depend on his participation. The Halcyon accounts were frozen within 48 hours. The other entities in the network were identified and flagged. The financial forensics work that followed, tracing the movement of money through years of layered corporate transactions, took months and involved specialists I never met and processes I only understood in general terms. But it moved. Steadily and invisibly, the way federal investigations move, it moved. Carol gave her first formal recorded statement to Diane and a colleague on the Monday following Garrett's questioning. She gave it at a federal office building with an attorney present. I had insisted she have her own counsel, and she had agreed without argument. I did not attend. We were, by that point, staying in the same house but living in a kind of careful parallel, occupying the same space, being civil, being honest when spoken to, but no longer operating as a unit. The marriage had not formally ended. It had simply stopped. Derek did not know the full story yet. Nina did not know anything yet. That was the part that kept me awake in a different way than the investigation had. Not fear, not anger, just the particular dread of knowing that the people you love most are about to have their understanding of their lives altered by something they had no part in and no ability to prevent. I told Derek on a Sunday afternoon, about 3 weeks after Garrett's arrest. I drove to his apartment, and I sat across from him at his small kitchen table, the same table where he had cooked that chicken dish, and we had talked about old films, and I had performed normalcy while the world was falling apart around me, and I told him the truth. As much of it as was mine to tell. I told him about the phone and the call and what I had found. I told him about Halcyon and Garrett. I told him about his grandfather, about what the documents had suggested, and what the investigation was now pursuing regarding the circumstances of Gerald Pruitt's death in 2011. I did not tell him everything about Carol's involvement in the earliest years. That was Carol's story to tell him, and she did, separately, on a different Sunday afternoon. I know that conversation happened because Derek told me it had. He did not tell me what was said in it. I did not ask. What Derek said to me, after I told him what I told him, was this. He sat very still for a long moment, and then he said, Grandpa knew. At the end, he knew what was happening, and he was trying to get out of it. I told him yes. I believed so, he said. And he was going to tell you. I told him yes. I believed that too. Derek nodded slowly. He picked up his coffee cup and put it down without drinking. Then he looked at me and said, "Dad, how are you doing? Not the situation. You. How are you actually doing?" I thought about it honestly before I answered. I told him. Some days were better than others. I told him the anger had been the first thing, and the grief had been underneath it, and was taking longer to process. I told him that the strange thing about what I was going through was that the losses were all different shapes. The loss of the marriage as I had understood it, the loss of the version of my father's death I had lived with for 14 years, the loss of the version of my own life story I had believed to be true. He got up from the table and hugged me. He is not a man who does that easily. He is more like me, physically reserved in the way our family tends to be, and I was grateful for it in a way I couldn't express. Nina was harder. She came home from Pittsburgh for a weekend in December. I had asked her to come, told her there were things I needed to tell her in person, which had worried her enough that she drove the whole way rather than taking the train she usually preferred. I told her what I had told Derek, with the same careful boundaries about what was mine to share and what was Carol's. Nina's response was not Derek's quiet stillness. Nina was 26 years old and had her mother's emotional intelligence and my tendency toward precision and the particular intensity of a person who had grown up watching her parents be good to each other and had built her own understanding of relationships partly on that foundation. Learning that the foundation had fissures she hadn't known about. That was hard for her in a specific way that I had anticipated, but still found painful to witness. She was angry at Carol in a way that Derek was not, or at least not openly. She told me, on the second evening of her visit, that she needed time before she could speak to her sponsor. I told her I understood, and that I thought that was fair. I told her that what Carol had done was complicated, that there was more fear and entrapment in it than simple betrayal, but that I wasn't going to tell her how to feel about it. Nina said, "She sat across from all of us for 25 years. I said, "Yes." She said, How do you even begin to reconcile that?" I told her I wasn't sure I had an answer to that yet. She stayed the weekend. She helped me cook on Sunday evening. Before she left, she hugged me for a long time in the driveway and told me she loved me. I told her I loved her. She drove back to Pittsburgh. She called Carol 3 months later, a short call. I know only that it happened because Carol told me, quietly, without asking me for any particular response. It was a beginning of something, or perhaps just a tentative opening of a door. I did not ask Carol what was said. It was not my conversation to own. The divorce was finalized 8 months after Garrett's arrest. It was not acrimonious. Carol did not fight any of it. She had her attorney, and I had mine, and the process was handled with the kind of quiet practicality that suits two people in their 60s who have no interest in punishment and no energy for theater. We divided things fairly. The house went on the market and sold within 6 weeks. The proceeds were split. I want to be careful about how I describe Carol in this part of the story, because I have had 18 months to think about who she is and what she did and what I feel about it. And I do not want to give you a simple answer, because there is no simple answer. She was a participant in something fraudulent for 25 years. She was also a young woman who made a frightened choice in 1998 and found herself unable to climb out of the consequences of that choice. She was someone who protected my father's memory in the only way available to her, by saying nothing and enduring everything, while also being complicit in the cover-up of his death. She was a woman who spent 12 years waiting for the day when she could finally tell the truth, And when that day came, she told it completely and without reservation. She was my wife for 32 years. She was a good mother. She was a genuinely warm person who loved her children and her community and her library and an Italian restaurant where she ordered badly but with tremendous confidence. She was also someone who kept a secret in the dark place at the center of our marriage for most of its duration. I do not hate her. I tried to, briefly, in the worst of it, because hate would have been simpler, cleaner, easier to carry. But I couldn't make it stick. What I feel is something more complex and more honest, though, than hate. Something closer to grief and understanding, and the particular sadness of losing a person who is still alive. I hope she is all right. I believe she is doing her best. I think she always was, even when her best was not nearly enough. Garrett Pruitt was formally indicted on 11 federal counts, including conspiracy to commit wire fraud, money laundering, and obstruction of justice. The investigation into the circumstances of my father's death was merged with the broader case. The specific charge related to Gerald Pruitt was conspiracy in connection with an unlawful death, which is the way federal prosecutors framed what the documents described and what several additional pieces of evidence supported. I was told by Diane in one of our periodic update calls that Garrett had eventually begun cooperating with prosecutors after his co-defendants started talking. I was told that his cooperation, while coming later than Carol's, added significant detail to the picture that investigators were building. I was told that the case against him was strong. As of the time I'm recording this, and I want to be precise about this because these things move slowly, Garrett has entered a guilty plea on 8 of the 11 counts. Sentencing has not yet been scheduled. The process continues. The law moves at its own pace. I was asked if I wanted to submit a victim impact statement. I spent 3 evenings writing it. I wrote about my father, not about the fraud, not about the mechanics of what had been done, but about Gerald Pruitt as a man. The man who had liked a small Italian restaurant on the east side of Columbus, who had become a grandfather and come to visit and had seemed different somehow, quieter than usual, who had hugged me for a long time at Christmas 2010 and whom I had thought was simply getting old, who had been trying to find the courage to tell me the truth. I wrote about what it meant to spend 14 years grieving a death and then discover that your grief had been built on a lie. Not to diminish it. The grief was real. The loss was real. But to understand that you had been denied the truth of it, that you had been managed and maneuvered, even in your mourning. I sent the statement and have not read it again since. I moved to Tennessee in the spring, a small town in the eastern part of the state, in the foothills of the Appalachians, the kind of place where the light is different from Ohio, softer somehow, and the mornings are quiet in a way that takes some getting used to. I found a modest house on a road with few neighbors. I have a porch. I have begun, for the first time in my adult life, to sit on a porch in the morning with coffee and do nothing in particular. I am not entirely sure what the next chapter looks like. At 61, after 32 years of a shared life, the solitude is sometimes genuinely peaceful and sometimes genuinely hard, and often both at once. Derek calls on Sundays. Nina texts more than she used to. I think the distance clarified something for her about wanting to stay connected. Bud visited in the summer and we fished badly for 2 days and talked about nothing important, and it was exactly what I needed. I have thought a great deal in these 18 months about what I learned. Not about the conspiracy or the investigation, about myself. About the kind of trust I had practiced, and what it cost me and whether I would practice it differently if I could go back. Here is what I have concluded. I do not think the lesson is to trust less. I have seen what a life organized around suspicion looks like. I saw it in the documents in that storage unit. in the architecture of a network of shell companies and burner phones and careful evasions built by people who trusted nothing and no one. That is not a life. That is a fortress. And fortresses are for people who are afraid. But there is something between blind trust and its absence. There is the practice of paying attention, of noticing the small things and not dismissing them out of comfort or convenience, or the simple human desire to not have the life you have built turn out to be different from what you believed. There is the habit of asking questions, not from suspicion, not from fear, but from genuine engagement with the people you love, of knowing them, really knowing them, not just the version they present, but the version underneath. My father knew something was wrong and could not find the words in time. I found the words, barely and late, and at tremendous cost, but I found them. I think about that sometimes on the porch in the morning. The gray Ohio light replaced by Tennessee hills. The oak tree not visible from here. It belongs to whoever bought the house on our old street now, to whoever stands in that kitchen and looks out the window at its color in autumn. I miss it sometimes. The tree and the kitchen and the 32 years. But I am here, and the morning is quiet, and the coffee is good. And I have learned, at 61 years old, later than I would have chosen, but perhaps exactly when I was ready, that the truth, however hard it is to find, is always worth finding. Even when what it costs you is everything you thought you had, because what you thought you had, it turns out, was never quite what it was. And what you actually have, the real version, the true version, the one that can bear examination, that is something you can actually stand on. That is something that will not give way beneath you in the night. If you've made it to the end of this story, I want to thank you for staying with me through all of it. This is not an easy story. It is not a comfortable one, but I believe it is an honest one. And I want to leave you with one thought. Not advice. I am not in the business of telling anyone how to live. Just a thought. Trust the people you love. Trust them genuinely and fully, and without the constant weight of suspicion. That kind of trust is a gift you give, not a risk you take. But stay awake. Pay attention. Know the people beside you. Really know them. Ask the questions. Notice the small things, not because you expect to find something wrong, but because the people you love deserve to be truly known, and because you deserve to truly know them. The truth is not your enemy, even when it costs you everything, even then. If this story reached you tonight, wherever you are watching from, I hope it reminded you of something important. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what this story made you think about. And if there's someone in your life you've been meaning to truly talk to, really talk to, maybe don't wait as long as I did. Thank you for watching. Take care of yourselves, and take care of the people beside you. Good night.